Hello, thank you all very much for joining the session today. We're going to be talking about supply chain security. My name is Daniel Nurmi. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Anchore, and I'm joined here today by Paul Novarese, who's our senior solutions architect, also here at Anchore. Anchore is a company that provides users open source technology, products, and services that really are targeted at enabling users to bring continuous security and compliance enforcement directly into the DevOps toolchain. For the presentation today, we're going to be focusing in on a topic that's been very prominent recently in the security space, which is really centered around supply chain security. First, we're going to be discussing what supply chain in the context of software really looks like and why malicious actors are starting to target supply chain situations in order to implement some of their successful attacks. We'll start off by that discussion, and then once we get through that piece of the presentation, we'll move over to have Paul then jump in with some practical recommendations and examples of how we can bring security and compliance enforcement into your DevOps toolchains today to try to prevent some of these attacks. So starting with a lot of what we've been seeing these days in terms of the bad headlines, right? We see a lot of really prominent and serious security incidents over the last several months, namely, some of the more prominent ones. SolarWinds was definitely something that caught the attention of the security world. And in addition, more recently, there's another one from another company called CodeCov. And we see a lot of these incidents using a phrase associated with what's going on, and that's supply chain risks, supply chain security, and a number of customers that are impacted by these events. And we wanted to have a discussion about really, exploring what that means and what's happening in these incidents. And we can start with this kind of typical iceberg view, in that what we're seeing above the surface is a lot of discussion about what happened, the sort of top level hack and the exploits and things that are compromising customers and pretty large enterprise organizations associated somehow to some other element in the so-called supply chain. And really, though, if we look into what actually started the whole incident, a lot of those attacks, especially in the supply chain security world, are targeting software suppliers and or open source dependencies, something very much earlier in the story than where the attack actually happened, where the damage was caused. And we can see this by evaluating, what is a supply chain, and look at it from a couple of different perspectives. The first perspective is from the consumer view. That is, any organization that is actually deploying production software. We might have something internal that we're running in production, or it might even be internet facing, might be a website, an application, whatever that may be. At the end of the day, that's the software that's executing, and we call those the consumers. And from a consumer's perspective, they know, this is my application that's actually running in production. And in order to get that application to run, I depend on a number of different software elements that are all composed together to provide that production environment. Those can be other software suppliers, they can be open source software that comes in, that all in aggregate comes together to form the actual application. Interestingly, though, from a supplier view, if we as a software supplier look at what we have visibility into, it looks a little different and starts to expand out. And this is where we start to see a chain sort of forming. We know as the software supplier who our consumer is. We also know that as a software supplier, we ourselves are in a sense the consumer, because we're bringing in other software from other software suppliers and open source projects to build our own software and then deliver that to the consumer. If we zoom out another level and say, for just an oracle, and we're not taking from any particular perspective inside the chain, but just in general, the chain or the graph starts to look something like this, which, every software supplier is themselves a supplier, and there's a lot of open source elements in here, a lot of different pieces of software. And, this is the kind of thing where even this view is pretty oversimplified. Any sufficiently complex or sophisticated application running today is going to have even more independent elements than what we can fit onto a slide. And so this is interesting from a functional perspective, And we might even look at this as a consumer or a supplier and try to derive some information from it or understand what's going on. But from an attacker's perspective, if we look at this from a malicious actor's perspective, anytime we see a view like this, where there are dependencies between various elements and they all kind of funnel into something that we want to attack, i.e. the consumer application, we realize as a malicious actor, all we need to do is compromise any of these elements. And if we are able to actually get our malicious code or our attack successfully put into one of these environments, then that attack can actually flow all the way through to the consumer. And that would look something like this, right? If an attacker were to say, if I compromise this open source element or this software supplier's environment and get my malicious code in, that malicious code is going to make its way into the consumer's application, and that's where I'm going to cause the damage. And an interesting subtlety and characteristic of attacks like this is often that while the software supplier or the open source project, one of these elements in the graph is the actual initial place where an attack takes place, oftentimes those organizations won't even see it because the attacker isn't actually trying to cause damage at that point. They want to do that in a way that's hidden or secret because the actual attack is taking place in the consumer. And for that reason, sometimes these attacks can be around and very hard to notice for a long period of time. And we've seen that with some of these recent incidents. So what we're going to do is kind of zoom in on, okay, as a software supplier, we don't want to be the one